What can pizza teach us about priorities? And how can physicians use this lesson to create a life that is full of clarity and purpose? Keep listening to find out. This is the Physician Philosopher Podcast. I'm Dr. Jimmy Turner, an anesthesiologist, online entrepreneur, and creator of the Alpha Coaching Experience. The Physician Philosopher Podcast teaches you how to create the life you deserve, one thought at a time. Start before you're ready. Start by starting. Start now. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to episode number 68 of the Physician Philosopher Podcast, where we take an uncurated and unapologetic look into physician life, money, and mindset. So today's thought is this. When determining our priorities, it is easier to add to a blank slate than it is to remove responsibilities from an overwhelmed and overburdened schedule. All right, so the last week's been a bit of a doozy for the Turner household. So Kristen, my wife, popped up positive for COVID. Wesley and I, my little boy and I, we had it right around New Year's, and so for some reason, COVID has decided to attack our house in not at the same time, broken up into a series of events, and so this has obviously just made everything so much more complicated. But all of a sudden, Wesley and I've had it. My wife now has it, but my two girls don't. They haven't had COVID. And so all of a sudden, I'm doing the single dad thing, getting the kids up, making breakfast, packing lunches and water bottles, making sure they got masks, and that my 5-year-old is wearing the shoes on the right feet. Because, by the way, can we stop for a second? Like, it has always amazed me that there should be a 50-50 chance for a 5-year-old to get shoes on the correct feet. And it's like 95% of the time she gets it backwards. And I'm not sure if it's because of the way that the shoes are shaped when you look at them upside down or something, but totally confusing for my little girl. And then, of course, there's like trying to get them to school on time and, listening to a podcast. Our current favorite for the family is Faye and Fiends after making it through a couple of other podcasts. My kids are totally podcast addicts at this point, so they love listening to shows on the way. I think we started with the mysterious disappearance of Mars Patel or whatever that one's called, and ever since then they've been completely hooked. But after that, dropping them off, I'd come home, I take care of my wife, and she's quarantined, and my wife, Kristen, is, a busybody, like I am. I'm always super productive, and Kristen's always doing something. And so this was kind of a rare opportunity for me to get to hang out with Kristen and to just kind of veg, because she didn't have a lot of energy, and, have an opportunity to hang out with her and support her and help her and kind of take care of everything else. Since Wesley and I had COVID, I know that there's technically still a chance that I could get it again, but it was like 4 or 6 weeks ago. So I felt like that chance was small, and I wasn't going to pass up a chance to hang out with my wife. So we finally got around to watching a show that's been recommended to us like 1,000 times, because Kristen and I both played soccer in college, and so everyone's like, hey, you got to watch Ted Lasso, it's amazing. And you know what? It is amazing. We just finished, we binge watched, all the way through season 2, and it's quickly become one of our favorite shows. We absolutely love it. And, I've spent this week taking care of my family, and you'd think that, I'd have a lot of stress about the other things that I've kind of fallen behind on, like making podcast episodes or getting ready for the number of talks that I give each week for, personal finance curriculum. And, I have a personal finance curriculum for my 4th-year med students at Wake. And I'm actually thinking about creating something to help that with all of you listeners too. I'm actually in the throes of creating a product to help with personal finance for trainees all over the country. But I also give external talks to other places, and so, I've got all these things on my plate, and you think that would stress me out, but you know what? That's actually not what happened. And I think that most of us experience this, right? There are moments in life where we are forced to get really clear on what matters most to us. And for me, this happened recently with Kristen getting, COVID. So all of a sudden that, that clarity I'm constantly looking for in terms of, what's most important? What do I need to be doing right now? What should I be focusing on in terms of my energy and my purpose for this week? And honestly, bigger picture for my life. And when moments like this happen, when people get really sick and, there's nothing else that really takes priority over that, right? Like I had one job, taking care of my family. I had to care for my wife and take care of our 3 kids. That was it. And where I'd normally spend time thinking about my next podcast episode or writing, more work on my book or creating content for upcoming talks, that all really went to the wayside. And my only job was to make sure that my kids made it to their activities, food was on the table, kids were bathed, and hair was braided so that I wouldn't have to feed, what we call the tangle monster in our household, my 5-year-old. We have, when I brush her hair, she hates when her hair gets tangled, and I get it. It hurts. And so, we braid her hair at night. I braid her hair at night to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I don't have to feed the Tangle Monster, which is what we call the brush we use when I'm combing Anna's hair. And going through this experience where, we have an all of a sudden clarity really made me think about priorities in life. And that's exactly what happened this week for me, as I could really only have that one priority. Everything else took the back seat. Now, you've got to understand something about my family dynamic. So my wife, Kristen, is our rock. She is what makes everything work in our family. And part of this is because I am like a very big picture, abstract problem visionary kind of person. I make complicated things really simple. I create frameworks to explain problems that other people have a hard time understanding and provide clarity to people. That's why I love coaching, is because I've always been this person that people have come to for advice my entire life. And I love helping people figure out what seems complicated to them and give them the clarity and that they need to take that next step, whatever it might be in their marriage or in their career or, what have you. And this might sound really good, but that kind of personality that I have comes with some really obvious failings too. I am absolutely and miserably terrible with details. So if you want me to help you figure out, what you should be doing with your next steps in your career, your life, I can do that better than most, if I'm being honest with you. However, if you want to know what I did last Saturday, or you need help creating like this detail-oriented process, I'm just not your guy. Like I'm not ever going to be, and never have been, the person who remembers, people's birthdays. I'm actually really bad with names too. And I tell people that. I'm really, really forgetful. And this is why my nickname at work is Dory, as in like the forgetful animated fish from Finding Nemo. I have short-term memory loss, and everybody knows this about me. Like if you're friends with me, people know they have to kind of check in with me because it's just not my forte. It never has been. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that Kristen, my wife, is the one that organizes all of the details, makes sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. She knows all of our schedules inside and out. She makes sure we can get to where we need to be, when we need to be there. She plans out our weeks because she's that detail-oriented person. And in this way, like, it works really well for us because we fill in each other's gaps. She has this superhuman ability to juggle all of these balls in the air. And so when she went into quarantine with COVID, I was the one responsible for all the details. And since that is not my natural strength, it required absolutely 100% of my focus. And so naturally I was like, oh man, this is going to be a tough week. Like, this is not what I'm normally good at. And you know what? It was really interesting because it didn't end up being a problem. It actually ended up being a huge opportunity for growth with my family. Because when moments like this happen in life, it kind of crystallizes our clarity, like immediately. When someone dies, when someone gets sick, that's just what happens. And having this one very big responsibility meant that I couldn't afford to focus on anything else. And so I didn't. I focused on my kids, and I focused on taking care of my wife. And in other words, it kind of wiped the slate clean for me and forced me to get really clear about what mattered most. And so I use that problem-solving kind of nature, that skill set that I have, to delegate to my kids. And I'm not going to lie, it was actually really, really awesome seeing my kids step up to the plate to really take ownership of being a part of the family. And honestly, they really grew a lot. And but that said, like, it wasn't without like fanfare. Like, I'm not going to tell you that everything went well. I actually had my personal finance talk for my students, and I'd already kind of created the talk. But I have that talk on Wednesday evenings. And so I told my kids, like, hey, I've got my office hours beforehand where my students can come and ask me questions. And then I give a talk after that. And so I told my little girl, Grace, she is 10, she's about to be 11. And I said, hey, Grace, I really need your help. If you could make sure that, we ordered dinner's on the way. And so if you could just make sure that everyone's fed, everyone has drinks, that you take care of them and get them ready for bed. And as soon as my talk for the fourth year students is up, I'm going to come upstairs and I'm going to, help tuck everybody in bed. But if you could just get things going for me, I would really appreciate it. And I walk upstairs after my talk gets done, which actually went really well. My students were really gracious to me because I kind of explained to them, like, hey, I didn't have as much time to, prepare for this talk that I normally do. And the talk actually went really well. But I came upstairs and I see on the counter on the kitchen table a measuring cup, and it's got water in it and a straw. And the reason why was because my kitchen was a total disaster. I hadn't had, really a chance to clean it yet. And so my kids are not very tall, and so they couldn't reach any of the other cups. And so my kids had decided to be resourceful and to use this red measuring cup as a cup to drink water from for dinner. And it's really interesting because I had two immediate simultaneous responses to seeing this measuring cup on the table with water on it. And the first thought honestly was like just complete and utter dad guilt. I was like, man, like I didn't even make sure that my kids had cups to drink out of for dinner. And so the first thought that I had was just guilt. And the second thought was, man, like look how cool it is. They learned how to be resourceful. They didn't come knocking on my door when I was giving my talk. And I was kind of proud of that, like my little girl and, my other two kids had figured out how to take care of themselves in a situation where they normally would have been, asking for us to do something for them. They figured it out themselves. And so, it was interesting because like that was kind of the entire week in a nutshell, just these moments of like, oh man, like this is not what I normally do. And then watching my kids step up to the plate time and time again. So our family really grew closer because of that adversity. And that's what these moments often do. They provide perspective and clarity, and other things that would normally happen simply, they get deleted. You find out really quickly like, hey, I thought this was a priority, but it's not right now. I didn't have the ability to do everything while I was taking care of everything else. And this clean slate is kind of what I want to talk about today in this episode, because these moments that we all have from time to time, and of course, over the last couple of years, all of us have had those moments more often than we usually probably do. But I spend a lot of time coaching clients on priorities. And so they're often trying to figure out exactly what they want to do with their career, what their next step is going to be. They're usually loaded up with leadership positions and various other tasks in their job, in addition to, the clinical responsibilities of being a physician in medicine. And the natural process that most people go through is that they try to gain clarity on the various things that they're involved in by subtracting. And what I mean by that is they start with their already very busy schedule that's often, overwhelming and overburdening them. And then they try to figure out which things can I subtract from my really busy schedule in order to get to that work-life balance that I want. And unfortunately, this often complicates things. It's not really the way that our brain works, and this is not the best way of going about doing it, because deleting or subtracting is infinitely harder than starting with carte blanche and adding what matters most. And so my situation this week, for example, is a great example of that. With Kristen being sick, I didn't have a choice. The slate was completely wiped clean. Starting from there, it was very obvious to me that I could only do three things this week. I could take care of my family, I could go to work for my clinical shifts, and prepare for the 3 talks that I had on my schedule. Everything else was not getting done. I wasn't going to do a podcast. I wasn't working on any other piece of my book right now. Like I wasn't going to be, solving great problems in my business. Those were the only 3 things that I could do. And how did I decide? By focusing on, only one of the 4 quadrants of time management, right? So we often talk about this. I looked at my tasks and, I always separate them. This is kind of comes from Stephen Covey. I love this idea, but urgent versus non-urgent, and then important versus not important. And I started realizing, okay, right now I only have time to take care of things that are both urgent and important. Anything else that doesn't fall into that box is going to be getting ignored this week. And I'm going to be honest with you, that included some things like exercise, which are highly, highly important, but not so urgent. I think I worked out once, and I normally try to work out 3 to 5 times a week. And that led me to my family, the 3 talks that I had to give, and my 2 clinical shifts. So this may sound like, the singular experience that I had, like, this wiping of the slate being clean, but this is actually how we're wired, and studies have shown this. There was a 2002 study where researchers from the University of Iowa looked into a question about, interestingly enough, how people purchase pizzas. And so they wanted to know, like, what would happen if people started with a blank slate and ordered their desired pizza from that blank slate, from that no toppings on it, versus one that was already loaded up and people subtracting them, right? The second group already contained toppings and having to take toppings off. Essentially what they wanted to know is if consumers built their pizza up from nothing, would this look different than if they scaled it down from a fully loaded, pizza? And the background here is that you have to understand something called the endowment effect. So the endowment effect is basically that we all think that anything that we have in our possession that we own is worth more than it actually is. And if you've ever sold a house, this is true, right? You put your house in the market and you get offers, and sometimes they're offensive, and you're like, no, this is my house. It is worth more than that. And so you know that you've experienced this, but the endowment effect is basically when you own something, you think it is more valuable than it is. So theoretically, if you had more toppings on your pizza and you started with that, you would think it's more valuable than it is. So they took 115 students to find out which one, like that, starting from carte blanche or the fully loaded pizza. Half of them were placed into the build-up group, which is the carte blanche group, and given a regular cheese pizza for $5. And then they could add any number of, I think it was 12 toppings, and each topping cost 50 cents. So, that maxed out pizza, if they started from the cheese pizza, added all 12 toppings, would be $11. In the scale down group, they were given a fully loaded pizza with all of the 12 toppings on them for $11, and they were told that they could take off a topping for 50 cents per ingredient. So basically, it's just the same exact experiment, just starting from opposite directions. But it's really interesting what they found. In the build-up group, the carte blanche group that started with a blank pizza, the average pizza ended up having 2.71 ingredients, so about 3 ingredients. While in the scale down group, it was closer to 6. So in other words, when you try to delete things that were already included in the pizza, it led to keeping twice as many ingredients on the pizza. In similar findings, they actually did the study. They repeated the study in Italy, and Italian consumers with pizza and with salad had similar results. And so, you might be like, Jimmy, okay, dude, this show's about money and mindset and life. Like, why are we talking about pizza right now? What can we learn from that? It's called the status quo bias. And this is what happens when people prefer to basically keep things the way that they are instead of doing the hard work to figure out what they actually want and getting to that, right? If you have the status quo, which is what you're currently doing, it is much easier to keep doing that, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you are miserable, even when you are burned out. And I see this in clients all of the time. They're just so scared of changing things. And when we start from an already fully loaded, this overburdened, overwhelming schedule, it is much harder to eliminate current responsibilities and tasks than it would be if you started from a clean slate and decided to sign up for what you actually wanted to do. And that's what happened to me, right? Like my slate got wiped clean this week with Kristen having COVID. And so it was very easy for me to pick, like, these are the 3 things that I can do right now. However, if I started with all of the things that I normally do, my podcast, my one-on-one coaching clients, the book that I'm working on, all of these talks, the big picture of my business and what we're trying to do and who we're trying to help, and this new product that we're working on behind the scenes to, teach personal finance across the country. Like, this thing is, it could be completely overwhelming, right? And if I tried to start from there and subtract, like, I never would have gotten to the 3 things. But when the slate got wiped clean, all of a sudden, it was pretty easy. This means that we have to fight against that status quo if we're looking to gain clarity about what matters most to you in your life and what direction you want to go with your career in medicine or your family life or the other various asks that you have on your time. In other words, let's just say that you're currently the medical director of your group. You hold a few leadership positions on different committees. You practice clinically. You have a physician side gig doing real estate, and you're also married with kids. That sounds really overwhelming. So how do you figure out, like, which of those things do you drop? And we talk about our hell yes policy all the time, right? Learning to say no to anything that doesn't make you say hell yes. And we'll talk about that in a second. But how do you go about figuring out which tasks to drop if you already have that really busy schedule? If you start from the status quo, or your current situation, basically, right, you will end up keeping more responsibilities. You're going to have twice as many toppings than if you started from a clean slate. And this is what happens when we make decisions about our schedule and our priorities, just like it does when we purchase pizzas. So there are some lessons to be learned from this study and recognizing that we are all wired to keep more than we would if we started with a clean slate and we voluntarily added the things that we wanted in terms of our priorities. So first, one of the first lessons you should learn from this is that we need to be quick to say no and slow to say yes. Because once things are added, it is so much harder to get rid of them. And this is why creating a hell yes policy is so important. Once you have a ton of clarity on what matters most to you in this life, it becomes so much easier to say no to anything that doesn't make you say hell yes. So you can be very quick to say no and extremely slow to say yes to new additional things. Otherwise, you'll end up saying yes to many things and saying no to what matters most, which is usually your family and your friends and the things that matter most to you. So be quick to say no, slow to say yes. Second, if you're trying to gain clarity on the direction of your career, how to stop feeling overwhelmed or to make tough decisions about your next step, it is better to start from a clean slate than it is to subtract things from your already busy schedule. The status quo bias is strong. And so you have to know that it exists, and you have to be willing to say, okay, what would I do if I started with a clean slate? Carte blanche. Where would I go? What would I do? That's the more important question to answer than what things can I remove? That's the wrong question. That's not going to get you to where you want to be. The third thing is that we have to ask ourselves, why do we have to wait for impossible situations to provide this kind of clarity? Like, why did I need to wait for Kristen to get sick in order for me to have a ton of clarity on this? And you know what? I'm not going to lie to you. Like, this is one of my biggest struggles in life, is really figuring out what is the purpose of my life? Where am I going? Like, there are a lot of things that I could do, but what do I want to do? How do I want to help people? And I'm not gonna lie, when the slate got wiped clean for me this week, I loved last week. It was a hard week, but it was so rewarding. It was so fulfilling. It was so full of purpose, taking care of my kids, and it was so obvious and clear to me what must be done that I didn't have to do all that other waffling and thinking about my career or my business and where I'm going. I just had the pleasure of having a hard, challenging week taking care of my kids. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't all, unicorns and rainbows, but it was so, so rewarding. And I loved not having to think all the time, because it's very hard for me to turn my brain off. I'm an overthinker. That is one of the ways that I buffer, is I overthink. And so that clarity was so, so good. But why do I have to wait for moments like that to have that clarity? Why do people, and we see this in numbers of ways in doctors, right? Like when people die, like family members die or get sick, or you see a doc get disabled or lose their job, like all of a sudden things get really clear pretty quickly. But why do we have to have that? Like, the truth is, we don't have to wait. You can get that clarity, from talking to people that you love. Talk to your coach, talk to advisors, talk to mentors, and that's certainly what my coach helps me do each week. So my coach Trisha is amazing, and she helps me, really get clarity on what is really important to me, whether that's how I want to help people or where I'm going in my business or my personal life. And it's just so important to have that clarity. But regardless of how you decide to get that clarity yourself, I encourage you to start to, think through this process from a clean slate, to build up, as in, the language that the pizza study used, to your ideal situation. So build up to your ideal situation as opposed to trying to scale down from your current status quo. Be quick to say no, slow to say yes. Otherwise, you'll end up keeping a lot of things that you don't have passion for or that don't bring purpose to your life. And when you lose your way, just remember pizza, priorities, and the status quo bias, because they will be great teachers to you. So today's thought was this: when determining our priorities, it is easier to add to a blank slate than it is to remove responsibilities from an overwhelmed and overburdened schedule. All right, my friends, until next time, I will see you next week. Start before you're ready. Start by starting. Start now. Take care.